On a frigid February morning in 2003, in the small town of Middlebury, Vermont, a young woman named Catherine Miller left her apartment to walk to her shift at the local diner. She was 23 years old, a recent graduate of the community college, known for her punctuality and her bright smile that regulars at the diner said could warm even the coldest winter day. She wore a burgundy coat that morning, her dark hair pulled back in a ponytail, her boots leaving impressions in the fresh snow that had fallen overnight. By noon, when she failed to arrive for her shift, her manager called her apartment. No answer. By evening, when her roommate returned home to find Catherine's keys still hanging by the door and her purse sitting on the kitchen counter, something inside her chest tightened with a fear she could not name. Catherine Miller had vanished somewhere between her front door and the diner 6 blocks away, and for 20 years. No one could explain how a woman could disappear on a Tuesday morning in a town where everyone knew everyone, where doors were left unlocked and strangers were noticed immediately. The snow had covered her footprints by midday. The question that would haunt Middlebury for 2 decades was simple and terrible. Where did Catherine go, and who made certain she would never come home? Middlebury sits in the Champlain Valley of western Vermont, cradled between the Green Mountains to the east and Lake Champlain to the west. In 2003, it was a town of roughly 8,000 residents, a place built around Middlebury College and sustained by dairy farms that stretched across the rolling hills in every direction. Main Street was lined with brick buildings from the 19th century, their facades well-maintained, their storefronts housing bookshops and cafes, and the kind of hardware store where the owner still knew your name. The Otter Creek ran through the center of town, its waters dark and swift even in winter, cutting beneath stone bridges that had stood for more than 100 years. This was a community where church suppers brought out half the town, where high school basketball games filled the gymnasium with parents and grandparents, where crime was almost always a matter of teenage mischief or the occasional domestic dispute that neighbors pretended not to hear. People who lived in Middlebury often described it as the kind of place where you could raise children without worry, where you could walk alone at night, where tragedy was something that happened elsewhere, in bigger cities with darker reputations. Catherine Miller had grown up 40 miles away in Rutland, the daughter of a postal worker and a nurse. She was the younger of 2 children, quieter than her older brother, more inclined toward reading than sports. Her parents, Donald and Margaret Miller, described her as thoughtful, someone who noticed things others missed, who remembered birthdays and sent handwritten cards. She had moved to Middlebury after graduating from Community College of Vermont with an associate degree in liberal arts, drawn by the town's peaceful atmosphere and its proximity to the college, where she hoped eventually to enroll for a bachelor's degree. She shared a second-floor apartment on South Street with her roommate, Jessica Torres, who worked at the college library. The apartment was small but comfortable, with slanted ceilings and windows that overlooked the street below. Catherine's room was neat, her books arranged alphabetically on a shelf she had painted white, her bed always made, her clothes hung carefully in the closet. Those who knew her said she was saving money, planning for the future, talking about maybe becoming a teacher someday. She worked the morning shift at Miller's Diner, a local institution on Main Street that had no relation to her surname, but that she joked made her feel like she belonged there. The diner opened at 6 in the morning, serving breakfast to farmers and college students and retirees who gathered at the counter to discuss weather and politics, and who had won at poker the night before. Catherine usually arrived by 5:45 to help with setup, tying on her apron, starting the coffee, setting out the cream and sugar. The owner, Frank Delacroix, a man in his 60s who had run the diner for 30 years, said she had never been late, not once in the 14 months she had worked there. She took pride in her work, remembered how customers liked their eggs, knew which regulars wanted decaf and which wanted extra butter on their toast. February 11th, 2003 was a Tuesday. The temperature at dawn was 14 degrees Fahrenheit. The sky still dark and heavy, with clouds that promised more snow. Catherine had worked the previous day, Monday, a full shift from 6 in the morning until 2 in the afternoon. Jessica Torres would later tell investigators that Catherine had come home that evening in good spirits, tired but cheerful. They had made dinner together, pasta with marinara sauce, and watched television for an hour before Catherine went to her room to read. Jessica said she heard no phone calls, no unusual sounds, nothing that suggested anything was wrong. Catherine had set her alarm for 5:15 the next morning, as she always did on workdays. Clear's throat, Tuesday morning arrived cold and still. Jessica was still asleep when Catherine's alarm went off in the next room. She heard Catherine moving around, the sound of the shower running, the soft thud of footsteps as Catherine dressed and gathered her things. Jessica would remember later that she had heard Catherine in the kitchen, the refrigerator opening and closing, the clink of a spoon against a bowl. She assumed Catherine was eating cereal, her usual breakfast before work. At approximately 5:35, Jessica heard the apartment door open and close. She did not get up. She did not say goodbye. This was routine, the same every morning Catherine worked. Jessica drifted back to sleep, expecting nothing, suspecting nothing, unaware that she had just heard her roommate leave for the last time. The distance from the apartment on South Street to Miller's Diner on Main Street was 6 blocks, roughly a 12-minute walk at a normal pace. The route was straightforward: south on South Street for 2 blocks, then west on College Street for 3 blocks, then 1 block north on Main to reach the diner. It was a path Catherine had walked hundreds of times, in every season, in daylight and darkness. The streets would have been empty at that hour, the town still sleeping, the only sounds the occasional car passing and the crunch of snow beneath her boots. Streetlights illuminated the corners, casting yellow circles on the white ground. The snow that had fallen the night before was light, perhaps 2 inches, enough to dust the sidewalks and parked cars, but not enough to make walking difficult. Catherine Miller never arrived at the diner. At 6:15, when she had not appeared, Frank Delacroix assumed she was running late. He was mildly annoyed but not concerned. He made the coffee himself, turned on the grill, flipped the sign on the door to open. By 6:30, he was puzzled. By 7, when the breakfast rush was beginning and he was struggling to keep up alone, he called Catherine's apartment. The phone rang and rang. No answer. He tried again at 7:30. Again at 8. Nothing. At 9, with the morning crowd thinning and his irritation giving way to worry, Frank called Jessica Torres at the library. Jessica said she was certain Catherine had left for work that morning. She had heard her leave. Frank asked if anything had seemed wrong. Jessica said no, nothing at all, everything had been completely normal. Frank hung up and stood behind the counter for a long moment, staring at the phone, a cold feeling spreading through his chest. At 11:30 that morning, Jessica Torres left the library during her lunch break and walked home to check the apartment. She climbed the stairs and unlocked the door and stepped inside, and immediately saw Catherine's keys hanging on the hook by the door where they were always kept. Her purse sat on the kitchen counter, her wallet inside, her identification card and $43 in cash still there. Her coat closet was open, and Jessica could see that the burgundy coat Catherine had been wearing that morning was gone, but her other winter jacket, the heavier one, still hung on its hanger. Jessica stood in the kitchen, her heart beginning to pound, and looked around the small space. Everything was exactly as it should be except for the fact that Catherine was not there. The cereal bowl sat in the sink, rinsed but not washed. A coffee mug sat beside it. Jessica called Frank at the diner. Her voice shook. Frank told her to call the police immediately. The Middlebury Police Department received the missing person report at 12:17 in the afternoon on February 11th. Officer Daniel Wright took the call, noting the details in his logbook. Catherine Miller, age 23, last seen leaving her apartment at approximately 5:35 that morning. Destination Miller's Diner on Main Street failed to arrive. Keys and purse found at residence. Officer Wright understood the implications immediately. A young woman does not leave her purse and keys behind voluntarily. She does not vanish between her home and her workplace in a town this small without something terrible happening. By 1 o'clock that afternoon, Chief of Police Robert Nash had assembled every available officer, 12 men and women in total, and organized them into search teams. They would begin at the apartment on South Street and work outward, covering every inch of the route Catherine would have taken to the diner, searching alleys and yards, and any place a person might be hidden or hiding. The temperature was dropping as afternoon wore into evening, the thermometer reading 9 degrees by 4 o'clock. Volunteers began arriving, summoned by word of mouth and a brief announcement on the local radio station. College students came, bundled in winter gear, carrying flashlights. Neighbors came, farmers who had finished their afternoon chores, shopkeepers who closed early. By 5 o'clock, more than 100 people were walking the streets of Middlebury, calling Catherine's name, peering into dumpsters and behind garages, checking the banks of Otter Creek, where the snow lay thick and undisturbed. The search continued into the night, headlights from police cruisers illuminating the falling snow, voices echoing through the dark. They found nothing, no footprints that led anywhere unusual. No signs of struggle, no blood, no torn fabric, no indication that anything violent had occurred on those 6 blocks between Catherine's home and her place of work. Those who knew Catherine said she was not the kind of person to run away, to disappear without explanation. Her parents drove from Rutland that evening and stood in the cold outside her apartment, their faces gray with fear, and told police that Catherine had been happy, had no reason to leave, had no problems with money or relationships or anything that might cause her to flee. Jessica Torres told investigators that Catherine had no boyfriend, no romantic entanglements, no conflicts with anyone she knew of. Frank Delacroix said Catherine was reliable, responsible, never missed work, never complained. The picture that emerged was of a young woman whose life was stable and ordinary, whose disappearance made no sense at all. On the second day, February 12th, the search expanded. State police arrived with tracking dogs, German shepherds trained to follow scent trails. The dogs were given items from Catherine's room, her pillowcase and a worn sweater, and they led their handlers south on South Street, the same path she would have taken toward the diner. At the corner of South Street and College Street, the dogs became confused. They circled, noses to the ground, and then sat down. The handlers tried again. Same result. It was as if Catherine's scent simply ended at that intersection, as if she had evaporated into the winter air. Those who have ever doubted what they can trust, who have felt the ground shift beneath certainty, might understand the sick feeling that settled in the stomachs of the searchers at that moment. The dogs could not be wrong, but where had she gone? Investigators began interviewing everyone who lived along Catherine's route to work. An elderly woman named Helen Grant, who lived on the corner of South Street and College Street, told police she had been awake that morning, had risen early to take her medication, and had looked out her window around 5:40. She said she saw a young woman in a dark coat walking south on South Street. She could not say for certain it was Catherine, but the timing matched. She saw no one else, no cars, no other pedestrians. The woman walked past her window and out of sight. Helen Grant went back to bed. She heard nothing unusual. A college student named Marcus Reed, who delivered newspapers in the early morning hours, told police he had been on his route that Tuesday, driving his old pickup truck through the streets between 5 and 6:30. He said he might have seen someone walking near College Street. He could not be sure. He had not paid close attention. He was focused on his deliveries, trying to finish before his 8 o'clock class. He remembered the streets being empty, quiet, normal. He saw nothing that alarmed him. Deputies whispered quietly among themselves about the lack of evidence, the absence of any clue. Chief Nash held a press conference on February 13th, 3 days after Catherine's disappearance, and stood before television cameras and newspaper reporters and said the Middlebury Police Department was doing everything possible to find Catherine Miller. He said they had searched hundreds of acres, interviewed dozens of people, followed every lead. He said they had no suspects at this time but were investigating all possibilities. He asked anyone with information to come forward. He looked tired, his face drawn, his voice steady but strained. Behind him, Catherine's parents stood with their hands clasped together, their eyes red from crying. Margaret Miller held a photograph of her daughter, the image showing Catherine smiling in summer sunlight, her whole life still ahead of her. The media coverage was extensive. Catherine's face appeared on the front page of the Rutland Herald and the Burlington Free Press. Local television stations ran segments every evening, showing her photograph, repeating the details, urging anyone with information to contact police. The story spread beyond Vermont, picked up by regional networks, shared on early internet message boards where armchair detectives speculated about what might have happened. Theories proliferated. Some believed she had been abducted, taken by a stranger passing through town, though no suspicious vehicles had been reported. Some believed she had been a victim of someone she knew, though investigators could identify no one with motive or opportunity. Some believed she had suffered an accident, fallen through ice or into some hidden space, though searchers had checked every possible location. The truth remained elusive, maddeningly out of reach. Clear's throat by March, the active search had scaled back. Police continued to follow leads, but the daily search parties stopped. The volunteers returned to their lives. The media moved on to other stories. Catherine Miller became a cold case, another name in a file, another family left without answers. Her parents returned to Rutland, but came back to Middlebury every weekend for months, walking the streets where their daughter had last been seen, posting flyers with her photograph, asking questions of anyone who would listen. Jessica Torres moved out of the apartment in April, unable to bear living in the place where Catherine's absence was a constant presence. Frank Delacroix hired a new server at the diner, but sometimes, in quiet moments, found himself looking toward the door, half expecting Catherine to walk through and apologize for being late. The case remained open, technically, but without new evidence or witnesses, there was nowhere for the investigation to go. Detective Sarah Brennan, who had been assigned as the lead investigator, kept the file on her desk for 2 years before finally boxing it up and moving it to storage. She told colleagues she believed something terrible had happened to Catherine Miller on that February morning, that someone knew something they were not saying. That somewhere in the accumulation of details was the answer. But she could not find it. The case went cold. Time passed. The town of Middlebury moved forward, though those who had known Catherine or who had searched for her carried a small weight of unfinished grief. For Catherine's parents, time did not heal. It only stretched the wound. Donald Miller retired from the Postal Service in 2005 and spent his days watching crime shows on television, reading about missing persons cases on the internet, searching for patterns or connections that might explain what had happened to his daughter. Margaret Miller returned to nursing but found she could not concentrate, could not stop thinking about Catherine during every shift, every moment of silence. They attended support groups for families of missing persons, sat in church basements with other parents and siblings and spouses who lived with the same unanswered questions. Those who have ever doubted someone you love, who have wondered if the person you thought you knew was somehow different, might understand the quiet torture of not knowing. Did Catherine suffer? Was it quick? Is she somewhere waiting to be found? Or is she gone, erased from the earth, existing now only in memory and photographs? In 2007, 4 years after Catherine's disappearance, Margaret Miller began having dreams. She would wake in the night, her heart racing, certain she had heard Catherine calling for her. She would dream of snow and darkness, and a voice she recognized but could not reach. Donald would wake beside her and hold her while she cried, and neither of them would speak, because there was nothing left to say that had not already been said 1,000 times. They considered moving away from Vermont, starting over somewhere else, but they could not. What if Catherine came back and they were gone? What if someone found her and needed to contact them? They were trapped in a kind of limbo, unable to grieve fully because there was no body, no certainty, no end to the story. The years accumulated. 2008, 2009, 2010. Life in Middlebury continued. The college students who had helped search for Catherine graduated and moved away, replaced by new students who had never heard her name. The shops on Main Street changed ownership. Miller's Diner was sold in 2011 when Frank Delacroix retired. The new owners renovated, painted the walls, changed the menu. The booth where Catherine had always taken her break disappeared in the remodel. Physical traces of her presence in the town faded, though her name remained in police files and in the memories of those who had known her. In 2015, 12 years after Catherine's disappearance, her case was assigned to a new detective. His name was Michael Torres, no relation to Jessica, a 38-year-old investigator who had recently transferred to the Vermont State Police from Massachusetts. He had a reputation for persistence, for returning to cold cases with fresh eyes, for refusing to accept that some mysteries could never be solved. He requested the Catherine Miller file and spent 3 months reading every report, every witness statement, every scrap of evidence that had been collected. He created a timeline on his office wall, marking every known detail with colored pins and string. He drove the route from Catherine's apartment to the diner repeatedly, at different times of day, in different weather, trying to see what others might have missed. Detective Torres noticed something that previous investigators had documented but not fully explored. The corner where the tracking dogs had lost Catherine's scent, the intersection of South Street and College Street, was directly across from a small parking lot that served several businesses, including a real estate office and a photography studio. The lot was poorly lit, tucked back from the street, surrounded by a low wooden fence. On the morning of Catherine's disappearance, 2 vehicles had been parked in that lot. One belonged to the owner of the real estate office, a woman named Patricia Simmons, who had confirmed she had left her car there overnight after attending a dinner party. The other vehicle had never been identified. In the original investigation notes, there was a brief mention that patrol officers had seen a dark-colored sedan in the lot that morning, but had not recorded the license plate or make, because there had been no reason at that point to consider it suspicious. By the time Catherine was reported missing and officers returned to check, the vehicle was gone. Detective Torres decided to focus on that parking lot. He pulled records from the real estate office and the photography studio, looking for anyone who might have been in the area that morning. He interviewed Patricia Simmons again, now an elderly woman living in a retirement community in Burlington. She remembered very little about that morning, but confirmed she had not been to the office until later that day. The photography studio had closed in 2008, but Torres tracked down the former owner, a man named Dennis Crawford, who had moved to New Hampshire. Crawford said he had not been at his studio on the morning of February 11, 2003. He had no idea who might have parked a car in the lot. Torres expanded his search. He looked at every person who had been interviewed in 2003, cross-referencing their statements with other records. He found something interesting. A man named Richard Vance, age 41 at the time of Catherine's disappearance, had been questioned briefly by police. Vance worked as a maintenance supervisor at Middlebury College, a position that required him to be on campus early most mornings. He lived alone in a small house on the eastern edge of town. In his initial statement to police, Vance said he had left his house at approximately 5:45 on the morning of February 11th and had driven directly to the college, arriving around 6 o'clock. He said he had seen nothing unusual, had not been on South Street or College Street that morning, had no knowledge of Catherine Miller beyond recognizing her face from her photograph. Detective Torres pulled Vance's employment records and discovered that on February 11, 2003, Vance had not clocked in at the college until 7:30, an hour and a half later than usual. His supervisor at the time had noted it but had not questioned it because Vance had explained he had car trouble and had needed to stop for fuel. Torres obtained Vance's credit card records from 2003. There was no purchase at a gas station on the morning of February 11th. Torres pulled phone records. Vance had made no calls that morning. Torres requested vehicle registration information. In 2003, Richard Vance had owned a dark blue Honda Accord. Clear's throat. In September 2015, Detective Torres drove to Richard Vance's current address in Shelburne, a town 10 miles north of Middlebury. Vance now worked for a private maintenance company and lived in a duplex near Lake Champlain. Torres knocked on the door at 6 in the evening. Vance answered, a man now in his early 50s, slightly overweight, wearing jeans and a flannel shirt. Torres introduced himself and asked if they could talk about Catherine Miller. Vance's expression did not change. He invited Torres inside. The conversation lasted 2 hours. Torres recorded it with Vance's permission on a digital recorder. The detective later described Vance as calm, almost detached, answering questions without hesitation, but also without much emotion. Torres asked about Vance's whereabouts on the morning of February 11, 2003. Vance repeated what he had told police 12 years earlier. He had left his house, had car trouble, stopped for gas, arrived at work late. Torres asked where he had stopped for gas. Vance said he could not remember. It had been 12 years ago, maybe the station on Route 7. Torres asked why there was no record of a purchase. Vance said he must have paid cash. Torres asked if Vance had been near the intersection of South Street and College Street that morning. Vance said no, he had not. Torres asked if Vance had ever seen Catherine Miller in person. Vance said maybe. He could not be sure. Middlebury was a small town. Detective Torres asked Vance if he would be willing to take a polygraph examination. Vance said he would think about it and contact his lawyer. Torres left the duplex with a feeling in his gut that he had learned to trust over years of investigations. Something was not right. Vance's answers were too smooth, too rehearsed. His affect was wrong. Most people, when questioned about a missing person case from 12 years ago, showed some emotional response, surprise or curiosity or nervousness. Vance had shown nothing. Torres returned to his office and dug deeper. He requested a warrant to search Vance's current residence and vehicle. Citing the discrepancies in his alibi and his ownership of a car, matching the description of the unidentified vehicle in the parking lot. A judge granted the warrant in October 2015. On October 22, Vermont State Police executed the search. They found nothing directly connecting Vance to Catherine Miller, no physical evidence. No clothing, no personal items, But in Vance's basement, stored in a cardboard box, they found a collection of newspaper clippings about Catherine's disappearance. Articles from 2003. Photographs of search parties, coverage of the press conferences, dozens of clippings carefully cut out and saved. When confronted with this discovery, Vance said he had been interested in the case because it had happened in his town, because he had been questioned by police, because he wanted to follow the investigation. Torres asked why he had kept the clippings for 12 years. Vance said he did not know, it was just something he had done. Torres asked him directly, "Did you harm Catherine Miller?" Vance looked at the detective for a long moment and then said, "I want a lawyer." The case was now active again, but it remained frustratingly incomplete. The newspaper clippings suggested an obsession, but did not constitute evidence of a crime. Vance's inconsistent alibi was suspicious, but not proof. Without physical evidence or a confession, prosecutors believed they could not bring charges. Torres was furious. He was convinced Vance was involved, possibly responsible, but he could not prove it. The investigation stalled once more. In 2018, 15 years after Catherine's disappearance, a development emerged from an unexpected source. A woman named Laura Nichols, who had been a college student in Middlebury in 2003, contacted Vermont State Police. She said she had seen the news coverage about the renewed investigation into Catherine Miller's case and wanted to report something she had witnessed on the morning of February 11th, 2003. Something she had not fully understood at the time and had not reported to police because she had not realized its significance. Laura Nichols, now 35 years old and living in Boston, told Detective Torres that she had been walking to an early morning study session at the college library on February 11th. She said she had been on College Street, heading east toward campus, at approximately 5:45. She remembered the morning clearly because it had been so cold, and she had been annoyed about having to be up so early. As she walked, she had seen a car pulled into the small parking lot at the corner of College Street and South Street. The car's engine was running, exhaust visible in the cold air. She saw a man standing beside the driver's door, and she saw him helping a woman into the back seat of the car. The woman appeared unsteady, leaning heavily on the man. Laura said at the time she had assumed the woman was intoxicated or ill, and the man was helping her. She had not thought much of it and had continued walking. Torres asked Laura to describe the man. She said he was average height, wearing a dark jacket, possibly in his 30s or 40s. She had not seen his face clearly in the dim light. Torres asked about the car. She said it was a dark sedan. She could not identify the make or model. Torres showed her a photograph of Richard Vance from 2003. Laura studied it for several moments and then said, "It could be him. I'm not certain, but it could be." Torres asked Laura why she had not come forward in 2003. She said she had heard about Catherine Miller's disappearance several days later, but at that point, her memory of the incident in the parking lot had seemed vague and possibly unrelated. She had convinced herself it must have been something else, a different morning, a different woman. She had been young, uncertain, afraid of being wrong. Over the years, she said, the memory had haunted her. She had always wondered if what she saw had mattered. When she saw the renewed coverage of the case, she knew she had to speak up, even if it was 15 years late. Detective Torres now had a witness who placed a man matching Vance's description at the scene, at the right time, with a woman who appeared incapacitated. It was not definitive, but it was more than he had before. He presented the new information to prosecutors in the Vermont Attorney General's office. They reviewed the case and decided there was enough to convene a grand jury. In March 2019, a grand jury heard testimony from Detective Torres, from Laura Nichols, and from experts who analyzed the timeline and the evidence. The grand jury voted to indict Richard Vance on charges of second-degree murder in the death of Catherine Miller, despite the fact that her body had never been found. Richard Vance was arrested on March 28, 2019, at his home in Shelburne. He was 57 years old. Officers arrived at dawn with a warrant, and Vance answered the door in pajamas, his face showing surprise for the first time. He was read his rights, handcuffed, and led to a waiting police cruiser. Neighbors watched from their windows. News cameras were already arriving, alerted by the police department's public information officer. Vance said nothing as he was placed in the back seat of the cruiser. His expression was blank. The arrest made headlines across Vermont and New England. Cold case arrest. Man charged in 2003 disappearance of Catherine Miller. The story detailed the 16-year investigation, the renewed focus on Richard Vance, the witness who had finally come forward. Public reaction was divided. Some people in Middlebury remembered Vance as a quiet man, someone who kept to himself, and they found it hard to believe he could be responsible for something so terrible. Others said they had always felt there was something off about him, something they could not quite name. Those who believed and those who doubted argued in coffee shops and on social media, dissecting the evidence, debating whether a conviction was possible without a body. Vance's trial began in October 2019. The prosecution's case was circumstantial but compelling. They presented Laura Nichols's testimony, placing Vance at the scene. They highlighted the discrepancies in his alibi, the lack of a gas station purchase, the late arrival at work. They introduced the newspaper clippings, suggesting an obsession with the case. They presented testimony from a forensic psychologist, who explained that the collection of clippings was consistent with someone who was monitoring the investigation, ensuring they had not been discovered. They argued that Vance had encountered Catherine Miller on her walk to work, had incapacitated her through unknown means, had placed her in his vehicle, and had disposed of her body in a location that had never been found. They suggested the Otter Creek, with its swift current and deep pools, or one of the many remote areas in the surrounding mountains. The defense argued that the prosecution had no physical evidence, no body, no direct proof that Catherine Miller was even deceased, much less that Richard Vance had harmed her. They challenged Laura Nichols's testimony, noting that she had not come forward for 15 years, that her identification of Vance was uncertain, that memory was unreliable over such a long period. They argued that the newspaper clippings proved nothing except interest in a local case. They suggested that Catherine Miller might have left voluntarily, might have met with an accident unrelated to their client, might have been the victim of a random crime by someone who had never been identified. They portrayed Vance as an innocent man caught in the desperation of investigators to solve an unsolvable case. The trial lasted 3 weeks. Catherine's parents attended every day, sitting in the front row behind the prosecution table, their faces etched with 16 years of grief and hope. Jessica Torres, Catherine's former roommate, testified about the morning Catherine left the apartment, about finding her keys and purse. Detective Torres walked the jury through the entire investigation, the dead ends, the questions that had no answers. Laura Nichols took the stand and described what she had seen on that February morning, her voice steady, her certainty careful but present. She said, "I saw a man helping a woman into a car. The woman was not walking steadily. I remember thinking something seemed wrong, but I didn't know what to do." Richard Vance chose not to testify. He sat at the defense table throughout the trial, his expression neutral, taking notes on a legal pad, occasionally leaning over to whisper to his attorney. Those who watched him said he seemed almost bored, disconnected from the proceedings, as if they were discussing someone else's life. clears throat on November 7, 2019. After 2 days of deliberation, the jury returned a verdict: guilty of second-degree murder. The courtroom was silent for several seconds after the word was spoken. Then Margaret Miller gasped, a sound between a sob and a sigh, and Donald Miller put his arm around her shoulders. Richard Vance showed no reaction. He stared straight ahead as the judge thanked the jury and set a sentencing date. As he was led out of the courtroom in handcuffs, he glanced once at Catherine's parents. His face was empty. Sentencing occurred in December 2019. Richard Vance was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The judge, a woman named Carolyn Levine, spoke directly to Vance before imposing sentence. She said, "You have been found guilty of taking the life of Catherine Miller, a young woman with her entire future ahead of her. You have caused immeasurable pain to her family, to her friends, to her community. You have refused to provide answers, refused to show remorse, refused to reveal where Catherine's remains might be found so that her family might finally lay her to rest. This court can impose a sentence, but it cannot compel you to do what is right. I can only hope that someday your conscience, if you have one, will lead you to give the Miller family the peace they deserve." Vance was taken into custody immediately, transferred to a maximum security facility. He has never spoken publicly about the case. He has never admitted guilt. He has never revealed what happened to Catherine Miller's body. In interviews from prison, arranged through his attorney, he maintains his innocence and says he is appealing his conviction. As of 2023, 20 years after Catherine's disappearance, her remains have not been found. The case of Catherine Miller is both solved and unfinished. Justice, in a legal sense, has been served. A man has been convicted, sentenced, removed from society, but the deepest question remains unanswered. Where is Catherine? Her parents, now in their 70s, continue to hope that someday someone will find her, that they will receive a call from authorities saying their daughter has been located, that they can finally bury her with dignity and ceremony. They visit Middlebury occasionally, walking the streets where she once walked, keeping her memory alive. For those who have ever loved someone and lost them, who have lived with absence and uncertainty, the story of Catherine Miller is a reminder that some wounds never fully heal, that justice and closure are not always the same thing, that the truth can be both revealed and hidden at once. Catherine Miller was 23 years old when she vanished on a cold February morning, walking to work in a town where everyone knew everyone, where crime was rare, where tragedy was not supposed to happen. She was a daughter, a friend, a young woman building a life. Her absence left a void that no verdict can fill. But her name is remembered, her story told, her life acknowledged as having mattered. If this story mattered to you, if it reminded you of the fragility of life and the importance of truth, subscribe and hit the bell. Share this episode with someone who might need to hear it. Someone somewhere may still be waiting to be heard, waiting for justice, waiting for someone to care enough to keep searching. Catherine Miller's story is one of thousands, but every story matters. Every person lost deserves to be found. Every family deserves answers. And every community deserves to believe that even when darkness comes, someone will bring light.